Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't losing someone you love. It's pushing them away because you think you're not worthy of their heart. For 30 years, Ezra McKinnon lived alone in the Colorado mountains, convinced that his weathered hands and graying beard made him too old for love. When young Clara Whitmore confessed her feelings, he sent her away with harsh words. She was 18 and full of life. He was 48 and broken by years of frontier hardship. The girl left that day, but she made a promise that would echo through the mountains for a decade. 10 years later, Clara returned, not as the young girl he'd rejected, but as a woman whose love had only grown stronger. Now Ezra faced the hardest choice of his life. Could a man who believed he was too old to love learn that true devotion knows no boundaries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the San Juan Mountains like a widow's veil, and Ezra McKinnon stood on his cabin porch watching it rise. At 48, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to waste nothing. Not motion, not words, not emotion. His hands, scarred from decades of trapping and hunting, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had grown cold while he watched. The sun paint the valley below in shades of gold, and amber, the cabin itself, told the story of a man who had once planned for more than solitude. Built sturdy with hand-hewn logs and chinked with careful precision, it sat on a natural shelf of granite overlooking a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color. The structure was larger than necessary for one man, a main room with a stone fireplace that could warm a family, 2 bedrooms that had remained empty for 15 years, and a wraparound porch wide enough for rocking chairs that had never held evening conversations. Inside, on the mantel above the hearth, sat a worn leather Bible that had belonged to his father. Between its pages, pressed like memories themselves, were wildflowers that his wife Sarah had gathered in their brief time together. Purple lupine, Indian paintbrush, and mountain laurel, each bloom a reminder of dreams that had withered with her passing. Ezra rarely touched the book anymore, but neither could he bring himself to put it away. The sound of hoofbeats on the mountain trail interrupted his morning reverie. Doc Henley's familiar silhouette appeared through the pine trees, riding his steady mare with the careful posture of a man whose bones reminded him daily of 67 hard-lived years. Behind him, Martha Henley sat side-saddle on their gentle gelding, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a blue bonnet that matched her eyes. "Morning, Ezra," Doc called as he dismounted with a slight grunt. "Martha insisted we bring you some of her apple preserves and check on that wolf trap of yours." Martha slid down with her husband's assistance, smoothing her dark wool skirt. She had been the closest thing to family Ezra had known since Sarah's death, though he'd never been comfortable with the kindness she showed him. "Ezra McKinnon, you look thin as a rail," she said, studying him with the practiced eye of a woman who had mothered half the territory. "When did you last have a proper meal that didn't come from a can or your own hunting?" "I manage fine, Martha." Ezra accepted the jar of preserves with a nod. "Coffee still warm if you'd like some." Doc Henley tied the horses to the porch rail and stretched his back. "We're not here just for social visiting, though Martha does worry about you living up here like a hermit. There's talk in town about the Whitmore girl." At the mention of the name, something shifted in Ezra's expression, a tightening around his eyes that he thought he'd learned to control. "What about her?" "She's been helping at the schoolhouse," Martha said gently, settling into one of the porch chairs without invitation. "Sweet girl, Clara is. Smart as a whip and gentle as spring rain. Lost both her parents to the fever 2 winters back, and now she's living with her Aunt Millicent." Doc poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "The girl has a way with children, and she's been teaching some of the younger ones their letters. Millicent's getting on in years, though, and there's been talk about Clara maybe going to live with relatives in California." Ezra kept his expression neutral, but his hands tightened on the coffee cup. "That's her business, not mine." "Course it is," Martha agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Still, It's a shame to see such a bright young woman leave the territory. She's 18 now, you know, full grown and making her own decisions about life. The number hung in the air between them, 18, 30 years younger than Ezra, and yet he'd noticed her in ways that made him ashamed of himself. Clara Whitmore had grown from a gangly girl into a young woman with honey-colored hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and eyes the color of mountain sky after a storm. She moved through the small town of Cedar Ridge with a quiet confidence that drew people to her like flowers turning toward the sun. "She asked about you last Sunday after service," Doc said casually, settling into the chair beside his wife. "Wondered if you might need help with anything up here? What with winter coming on, I don't need help." The words came out sharper than Ezra intended. Martha exchanged a look with her husband. "No one's saying you do, Ezra, but that girl has a kind heart, and she sees good in folks even when they can't see it in themselves." Ezra rose abruptly, walking to the edge of the porch where he could look out over the valley. The morning mist had cleared completely now, revealing the small town of Cedar Ridge nestled in the valley below. From this height the buildings looked like toys, the white-steepled church, the general store, the modest homes scattered along the main street like beads on a string. "She's young," he said finally. "Has her whole life ahead of her." "That she does," Doc agreed. "But sometimes young folks have clearer sight than those of us who've been around longer. Sometimes they see possibilities we've talked ourselves out of." The conversation was heading into territory that made Ezra's chest tight with feelings he'd spent years burying. He'd noticed Clara, of course. Any man with eyes would notice her. But he'd also noticed the way other young men in town looked at her. Tommy Morrison from the feed store, the new bank clerk from Denver, even some of the ranch hands who came into town on Saturday nights. They were her age, full of dreams and futures that stretched ahead like open prairie. What could he offer her? A life of isolation in the mountains with a man whose best years were behind him. A cabin built for a family that would never come. The shadow of a woman whose memory he carried like a stone in his chest. "I should check those traps," Ezra said, turning back toward the cabin. "Thank you for the preserves, Martha." "Ezra." Doc's voice stopped him at the door. "Some advice from an old man who's seen his share of regrets. Don't let fear make your decisions for you. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of what people might say. Fear's a poor counselor, son." After they left, Ezra stood alone in his cabin, the jar of apple preserves on the table catching the afternoon light. Outside, a hawk circled high above the valley, its cry echoing off the mountain walls. The sound reminded him of Sarah's laughter. Clear and bright in the thin mountain air, he walked to the mantel and touched the worn cover of his father's Bible. The leather was soft with age and handling, and he could almost hear his father's voice, reading from it on Sunday mornings when Ezra was young. "Love is patient, love is kind," his father had read. Though Ezra wondered now if love was also cruel, taking what it gave and leaving a man empty-handed. The pressed flowers between the pages crumbled at his touch, fragments of beauty that time had made brittle, like memories, like hope. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Ezra allowed himself to think about Clara Whitmore, about the way she smiled at children in town, patient and encouraging, about how she'd helped old Mrs. Patterson with her groceries without being asked, or the way she'd sat with the miller's wife during her difficult pregnancy. Reading aloud from books of poetry, Clara had grown up in the shadow of loss, just as he had. Her father, Pastor Whitmore, had been a good man who died too young, leaving his daughter to find her own way in the world. Maybe that's what Ezra recognized in her, the quiet strength that came from surviving sorrow and choosing to remain tender despite it. But she was 18, and he was 48. The math was simple and unforgiving. By the time she reached his age, he'd be an old man of 78 if he lived that long. What kind of life would that be for her? What kind of man would steal a young woman's best years? The hawk's cry echoed again across the valley, lonesome and wild. Ezra understood that sound. It was the call of something meant to soar alone. The knock on Ezra's cabin door came on a Tuesday morning in late September, soft but persistent. He'd been mending a tear in his winter coat, preparing for the harsh months ahead when the sound interrupted the mountain silence. Through the window, he could see no horse tied to his porch rail, which meant whoever had come had walked the 3-mile trail from town. When he opened the door, Clara Whitmore stood before him, with her hands clasped in front of her simple blue dress, her honey-colored hair braided back, but with small tendrils escaping to frame her face. She looked nervous but determined, like someone who had walked a long way to say something important. "Miss Whitmore." Ezra stepped back, unsure whether to invite her in or ask what brought her to his remote cabin. "Is everything all right? Your Aunt Millicent is fine, Mr. McKinnon." Clara's voice was steady, though he could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest. "I came to speak with you about something personal." The word personal sent an uncomfortable flutter through Ezra's chest. He glanced past her toward the trail, half expecting to see Doc Henley or someone else following behind, but the mountain path was empty. "Perhaps you should come in. It's a long walk back to town." Clara nodded and stepped into his cabin, her eyes taking in the neat but sparse furnishings, the cold fireplace, the Bible on the mantel. She moved to the center of the room and turned to face him, her blue eyes meeting his directly. "Mr. McKinnon, I've come to tell you something that I fear will sound foolish, but I can't keep it to myself any longer." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I have feelings for you. Deep feelings that go beyond admiration or respect." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He stared at her, searching her face for some sign that he'd misunderstood, but her expression was earnest and unwavering. "Miss Whitmore, please let me finish." She held up a hand, her voice growing stronger. "I know what you're thinking. I know about the difference in our ages, and I know that people would talk. But I also know my own heart, and I know that what I feel for you is real and true." Ezra felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted. This beautiful, intelligent young woman was standing in his cabin, confessing love to a weathered mountain man old enough to be her father. The very idea was so far beyond his comprehension that he struggled to find words. "Clara," he said, using her first name without thinking, "you're 18 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Her chin lifted with quiet dignity. "I've known for months how I feel about you. When you come to town and help Mrs. Patterson with her heavy loads. When you fixed the schoolhouse roof without being asked. When you brought medicine to the Miller family during the fever outbreak. I see the man you are. Ezra McKinnon." The sound of his first name on her lips sent warmth through him that he immediately tried to quell. "What you see is a man who's lived too long and lost too much. I'm not the kind of man who can offer a young woman like you the life she deserves." "What kind of life do I deserve?" Clara stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "One filled with safety and predictability, or one filled with love and meaning? You deserve a man your own age. Someone who can grow old with you instead of leaving you a widow before you've had a chance to live." The words came out harsher than he intended, but he needed her to understand. "I'm too old for such foolishness." The word foolishness hit Clara like a slap, and he saw her flinch. But instead of backing down, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze with steel in her own. "Is that what you think this is? Foolishness?" Her voice remained steady, but he could hear the hurt beneath it. "Then you understand me even less than I thought." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, smooth riverstone, worn perfectly round by countless years of water and weather. "I found this by the creek where I've seen you fishing. I've carried it with me for weeks, thinking of what I wanted to say to you." Clara walked to his porch rail and placed the stone carefully on the wooden surface. "I'm leaving Cedar Ridge next week. Aunt Millicent has arranged for me to go live with her sister in California and continue my teaching there." The announcement struck Ezra with unexpected force. He'd known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated as fact made something clench tight in his chest. "That's probably for the best," he said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Clara turned back to him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she held them back with admirable strength. I want you to know that I meant every word I said. Age doesn't diminish love, Ezra. Fear does. And someday, when you're sitting alone in this cabin wondering what might have been, remember that someone once loved you enough to risk everything, even rejection. She picked up the stone and held it out to him. This stone has weathered every storm the mountain could throw at it and come out smooth and strong. That's what real love does. It endures. I'll wait for you, Ezra McKinnon, however long it takes for you to realize that love isn't foolishness. When he didn't take the stone, she placed it on the porch rail again and started toward the trail. At the edge of his clearing, she turned back one final time. 10 years, she called across the distance. I'll give you 10 years to decide if you're truly too old or just too afraid. Then she was gone, disappearing into the pine trees with the quiet grace that had first caught his attention. Ezra stood on his porch for a long time, staring at the smooth stone she'd left behind. The late afternoon sun caught its surface, making it gleam like a tiny beacon. That evening, Doc Henley arrived with news that Clara had indeed left Cedar Ridge, taking the stage to Denver and then the train west to California. The town was already talking about the loss of their young teacher, and several of the unmarried men were lamenting missed opportunities. She was a special one, Doc said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into his usual chair. Smart, kind, and stronger than she looked. Shame to see her go. Ezra said nothing, but his eyes kept drifting to the stone on the porch rail. Martha will miss having another woman to talk with, Doc continued. Clara spent a lot of evenings at our place, helping Martha with her quilting and talking about books. Girl had read more than most college men I've known. The doctor's words painted a picture of a life Ezra hadn't fully understood. Clara's quiet evenings, her love of learning, her gentle friendships with the older women in town. She hadn't been a flighty young girl chasing romantic fantasies. She'd been a thoughtful young woman who'd made a considered decision about her feelings. Doc, Ezra said finally, was I wrong to send her away? The older man studied him for a long moment. That depends. Were you protecting her, or were you protecting yourself? The question hung in the mountain air like smoke from a dying fire. After Doc left, Ezra sat alone on his porch as darkness settled over the valley. The stone caught moonlight now, a pale reminder of words spoken and chances offered. He picked up the smooth river stone and held it in his palm, feeling its weight and warmth. Clara had been right. It had endured every storm and emerged unmarked. But stones were not hearts, and hearts could break under the weight of too much hope or too much fear. 10 years, she had said. 10 years to decide if he was too old or too afraid. Ezra closed his fingers around the stone and walked back into his empty cabin, where the pressed flowers in his father's Bible crumbled a little more each time he thought of them. 2 years passed in the mountains like water over stone. Slowly, persistently, wearing away at the sharp edges of memory until what remained was smooth and aching. Ezra fell into routines that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But Clara's words echoed in the silence between his daily tasks like a song he couldn't forget. The seasons cycled through their familiar patterns. Autumn brought the aspen trees alive with gold that reminded him of Clara's hair. Winter buried the world in white silence. Spring coaxed wildflowers from the thawing earth. And summer heated the mountain air until it shimmered with possibilities. Through it all, Ezra trapped and hunted, repaired his cabin, and maintained the careful solitude he'd constructed around his life. But solitude, he discovered, was not the same as peace. The changes began small. Jake Morrison, a young ranch hand from the valley, started appearing at Ezra's cabin with requests for help. The first time, he needed assistance tracking a wolf that had been taking cattle from his employer's herd. The second, he wanted to learn how to read weather signs before winter storms. By the third visit, Ezra realized the young man was simply lonely and seeking the company of someone who understood the weight of mountain silence. Jake was 23, with sandy hair and earnest brown eyes that reminded Ezra uncomfortably of his younger self. He worked for the Hartley Ranch down in the valley, but dreamed of having his own spread someday. More importantly, he possessed the kind of steady temperament that made him easy company without being intrusive. My pa always said a man could learn more in a day with someone who knew the mountains than in a year of stumbling around on his own, Jake said one morning as they checked trap lines together. The early November air was crisp with the promise of snow, and their breath formed clouds as they spoke. "Your pa was a wise man," Ezra replied, resetting a spring trap with practiced efficiency. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes. He would have liked you," Jake said. He always respected folks who could make their own way without bothering others, but who'd lend a hand when it was truly needed. Ezra glanced at the young man, recognizing something in his tone. "He's passed on? 3 years now. Took a fall from his horse and never woke up." Jake's voice remained steady, but his hands stilled on the trap mechanism. "Left me and my ma to figure things out. She remarried a good man, but it's not the same." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, moving through the forest with the easy rhythm of men who understood each other's grief. As they walked back toward the cabin, Jake brought up the subject that Ezra had been dreading. "Mr. McKinnon, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Can't promise I'll answer." Jake kicked at a pine cone, sending it skittering across the trail. "Martha Henley mentioned that teacher who left town a couple years back, Miss Whitmore. Said she'd asked after you before she went to California." Ezra's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Martha talks too much, maybe so. But she also said Miss Whitmore was the finest young woman Cedar Ridge had seen in a generation. Smart, kind, beautiful." Jake glanced sideways at Ezra. "Made me wonder why a woman like that would leave. People leave for all kinds of reasons." "Yes, sir, they do." Jake was quiet for a moment. "But Martha also said she asked about you specific-like." "Wonder what that was about." Ezra stopped walking and turned to face the young man. "Jake, there are some subjects that a man keeps to himself. This is one of them." "Yes, sir. Didn't mean to pry." Jake had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's just that I know what it's like to lose someone you care about. And I reckon I know what it looks like when a man's carrying regret." The words hit their mark. But Ezra wasn't ready to examine the wound they exposed. "Let's get back to the cabin. Looks like snow coming." That evening, as the first flakes of winter began to fall, Ezra sat on his porch with Clara's stone in his palm. 2 years had passed since she'd left it there, and he'd moved it inside during storms, but always returned it to the porch rail. It had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of something he couldn't quite name. From town, news of Clara arrived in fragments, carried by Martha Henley during her periodic visits. Clara had found work at a school in Sacramento. She was well regarded by the community. She'd refused the courtship of a banker's son and the persistent attentions of a young lawyer. She'd written to Martha once, asking after the people of Cedar Ridge, but never mentioning Ezra by name. The letters she wrote but never sent existed only in Ezra's imagination. But he found himself wondering what she might have said. Did she think of him during California sunsets? Did she remember the mountain mornings when mist clung to the peaks like dreams? Or had time and distance done their work, wearing away her feelings until only polite memory remained? Winter deepened, bringing the kind of cold that made bones ache and fires struggle to warm a room. Ezra chopped wood until his shoulders burned, as if physical exhaustion could quiet the restless energy that seemed to have taken residence in his chest. Jake visited less frequently during the harsh months, but when he did come, he brought news from town and supplies from Martha Henley. "She's worried about you," Jake said one gray February afternoon, stamping snow from his boots before entering the cabin. "Says you're getting too thin and spending too much time alone." "I've been alone for 15 years. Haven't died yet." "No, sir, but being alone and being lonely aren't the same thing." Jake accepted a cup of coffee and warmed his hands around it. "My ma used to say that some folks are meant for solitude, and some are just hiding from company." Ezra gave him a sharp look. "And which am I?" "Well, sir, that's not for me to say. But I will say that you've got a kindness in you that seems like it wants to be shared with someone." The observation unsettled Ezra more than he cared to admit. Jake had a way of seeing through the walls Ezra had built, perhaps because the young man had built some of his own. They understood each other's silences and respected each other's boundaries. But Jake also possessed the courage to speak truths that others might leave unspoken. Spring arrived with unusual warmth, melting the mountain's snow in rushing torrents that filled the creeks and brought the wildflowers up early. Ezra found himself walking to places he and Sarah had explored together during their brief marriage. But instead of painful memories, he discovered something unexpected: the ability to remember joy without being overwhelmed by loss. It was during one of these walks that he encountered Martha Henley gathering herbs near the creek where Clara had found her stone. Martha looked up from her basket with a knowing smile that made Ezra immediately suspicious. "Ezra McKinnon, what brings you down from your mountain on such a beautiful day?" "Same thing that brings you out gathering herbs, I'd guess." "Spring fever," Martha laughed, a sound like water over rocks. "Spring fever indeed. Makes a person think about renewal, doesn't it? About second chances and new beginnings." She bent to pick a cluster of wild mint, adding it to her collection. "I had a letter from Clara last week." Ezra's hand tightened on the walking stick he'd been carrying. "Did you?" "She's doing well. Teaching at a fine school, respected by the whole community. But she asked after Cedar Ridge, wanted to know about the people here." Martha paused meaningfully. "All the people. That's natural enough. It was her home for a time." "Yes, it was." Martha straightened, studying Ezra with the directness of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "She also asked if I thought people could change. If a man who'd convinced himself he was too old for love might ever reconsider." The words hung in the spring air like pollen, heavy with possibility. Ezra felt his chest tighten with emotions he'd worked hard to bury. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that in my experience, people don't change so much as they grow into who they were always meant to be." Martha picked up her herb basket and prepared to leave. "And I told her that some men need more time than others to realize that love isn't about deserving. It's about having the courage to accept a gift freely given." As she walked away, Ezra remained by the creek, listening to the water flow over the stones where Clara had found her talisman. 2 years had passed since her confession, and he was no closer to understanding his own heart than he'd been that September day. But something in Martha's words had stirred a restlessness that felt different from the aching solitude he'd carried for so long. That evening, he took Clara's stone from the porch rail and held it up to the lamplight. Smooth, enduring, shaped by forces too patient to measure, it was exactly as she'd described it. Like love that weathers every storm and emerges unmarked. 8 years remained of the 10 she'd given him. 8 years to decide if he was too old or just too afraid. 5 years after Clara's departure, autumn came to the San Juan Mountains with an intensity that seemed to burn the very air. The aspen groves blazed gold against the evergreen slopes, and Ezra found himself thinking not just of Clara's hair, but of the way she'd moved through Cedar Ridge like light itself, warming everything she touched. The anniversary of her leaving had passed without acknowledgement, but Ezra felt its weight nonetheless. Half of her promised 10 years had elapsed, and he was no closer to understanding whether he was hiding from love or protecting them both from inevitable heartbreak. It was while rummaging through his dresser for a warmer shirt that his fingers found the small velvet box he'd hidden beneath his winter woolens. Sarah's wedding ring, a simple gold band they'd saved months to afford, lay nestled in faded silk like a relic from another man's life. Ezra sat heavily on the edge of his bed, holding the box in his weathered hands. He'd put the ring away after the funeral, unable to bear the sight of it on the mantel next to her Bible. For 15 years, it had remained hidden, neither discarded nor displayed, existing in the liminal space between memory and denial. The ring itself was modest, inscribed on the inside with words he'd almost forgotten. "Forever yours, E." Sarah had insisted on the inscription, despite the extra cost, laughing as she said she wanted to make sure he remembered his promises, even when his hair was grey and his memory failing. Well, his hair was grey now, and some memories had indeed faded. But others remained sharp as mountain air. The sound of Sarah's laughter, the way she hummed while cooking, the devastating silence of the cabin after the fever took her and their unborn child. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Jake Morrison stood on the porch, but something in his demeanor was different. Gone was the easy confidence of youth. In its place was the careful posture of a man bearing difficult news. "Mr. McKinnon, I hope you don't mind the interruption. Doc Henley asked me to ride up and let you know. He's taken ill. Heart troubles." The news hit Ezra like a physical blow. Doc Henley had been a constant in his life, a bridge between his isolation and the community below. The thought of losing that steady presence made something twist painfully in his chest. How bad is it? Bad enough that Martha's asked the preacher to come by, but Doc's a tough old bird. If anyone can pull through, it's him. Jake hesitated. "There's something else. Doc specifically asked me to tell you something." Ezra waited, Sarah's ring box still clutched in his hands. He said tell you that life's too short to spend it. Rehearsing for a funeral that hasn't happened yet. Jake's young face was serious as he delivered the message. "Don't know what that means, but he seemed to think you would." After Jake left, Ezra saddled his horse for the first time in months and rode down to Cedar Ridge. The town looked smaller than he remembered. The buildings more weathered, the streets emptier. Progress was coming to the territory in the form of railroads and telegraph lines, but it hadn't reached Cedar Ridge yet. The place still felt suspended in time, like a photograph of a simpler world. Doc Henley's house sat at the edge of town, a modest frame structure with a medical office attached. Martha answered Ezra's knock with red-rimmed eyes but a grateful smile. "Ezra, thank God you've come. He's been asking for you." The bedroom was dim and close, smelling of camphor and the peculiar stillness that attends serious illness. Doc Henley lay propped against pillows, his face grey, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence. "Ezra, you old hermit. Wondered if you'd make the trip down from your mountain. Wouldn't miss the chance to hear you complain about my bedside manner," Ezra replied. Settling into the chair beside the bed, Doc managed a weak chuckle. "Always did have a smart mouth on you." His expression grew serious. "I need to tell you something, and I may not get another chance." "Doc, let me finish." The older man's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades giving people news they didn't want to hear. "I've been doctoring in this territory for 40 years. I've seen men live who should have died, and I've seen men die who should have lived. You know what the difference usually is?" Ezra shook his head. "The ones who live are the ones who have something to live for. Not just duty or habit, but something that makes them want to see tomorrow." Doc's eyes fixed on Ezra with uncomfortable intensity. "You've been dying a little bit every day for 15 years, son. Dying of loneliness and calling it nobility. Doc, I don't think that girl loved you. Clara Whitmore loved you, with the kind of pure, simple truth that most men would kill for. And you sent her away because you thought you were protecting her from getting hurt." Doc's breathing was labored, but his words were clear. "Who are you really protecting, Ezra?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezra looked down at the ring box in his hands, realizing he'd carried it with him, without conscious thought. "I was 48 years old, Doc. She was 18. The arithmetic was simple." Arithmetic. Doc made a sound that might have been laughter if he'd had more breath. "Love isn't arithmetic, you stubborn fool. It's not about earning or deserving or calculating odds. It's about two people deciding that whatever time they have together is better than the time they'd have apart." Martha appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of broth and wearing the expression of a woman who'd heard this conversation before. "Don't tire yourself. Samuel," she said gently, setting the cup on the bedside table. "I'll tire myself if I want to," Doc replied with some of his old fire. "This man needs to hear what I have to say." He turned back to Ezra. "You think Sarah would want you to spend the rest of your life alone?" The mention of his wife's name made Ezra's chest tighten. "Sarah's gone, Doc. Yes, she is. And I'm sorry for that, sorrier than you know. But you're not gone, Ezra. You're still here, still breathing, still capable of love and joy and all the things that make life worth living. Sarah loved you enough to want those things for you. Ezra opened the ring box and stared at the simple gold band. I don't know how to let go of her. Who said anything about letting go? Martha spoke from the doorway, her voice gentle but firm. Love doesn't disappear when someone dies, Ezra. It just changes shape. Sarah will always be part of who you are, but that doesn't mean your heart is too full for anyone else. That evening, as Ezra prepared to ride back to his cabin, Martha pulled him aside. Clara writes to me every few months, she said without preamble. She never asks about you directly, but she always asks about the mountain people, about whether everyone is well and happy. Martha, she's 23 now. Ezra, no longer the impetuous girl who walked up to your cabin 5 years ago. She's been offered positions at prestigious schools, courted by successful men, invited to join society families, but she's turned them all down. That's her choice to make. Yes, it is. Just as it's your choice whether to spend the next 5 years learning to live again, or the next 50 years dying slowly on that mountain. Martha's eyes were kind, but uncompromising. That girl gave you 10 years, Ezra. Half of them are gone. What are you going to do with the rest? The ride back to his cabin took place under a canopy of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Ezra's horse picked its way carefully up the mountain trail, while Ezra held Sarah's ring in his pocket and thought about Doc Henley's words. 5 years had passed since Clara's confession, and what did he have to show for them? More isolation, deeper silences, and the growing certainty that loneliness was not the same as peace. He told himself he was protecting Clara from the heartbreak of loving an older man. But the truth was simpler and more selfish. He was protecting himself from the risk of losing someone again. But as Martha had pointed out, he was losing anyway. Every day he spent alone was a day he could have spent loving and being loved. Every sunset he watched from his empty porch was a sunset that could have been shared. Every meal he ate in silence was a conversation that might have brought joy to both their lives. At his cabin, Ezra sat on the porch steps and took Clara's stone from the rail where it had waited faithfully for 5 years. Smooth, enduring, shaped by patient forces into something beautiful. It was everything she'd said it was. 5 years remained of her promise. 5 years to decide if love was worth the risk of loss, if sharing a life was better than protecting a heart. In the distance, a nightbird called across the valley, its cry echoing off the mountain walls. But for the first time in years, Ezra didn't hear loneliness in that sound. He heard possibility. 7 years had passed since Clara Whitmore walked down the mountain trail and out of Ezra's life, and change had come to him as gradually as seasons turning. It began with small things, a walking stick he carved during the long winter evenings, each deliberate cut of the knife revealing something he hadn't known was there. The stick had started as a simple piece of pine, fallen during a November storm and dried through the winter months. But as Ezra worked it smooth, his hands seemed to find their own wisdom, shaping curves and adding details that transformed utility into something approaching art. Along its length, he carved small notches, not to mark days or count time, but to give his fingers something to trace when his thoughts turned to memories he'd long kept buried. Spring brought Jake Morrison up the mountain trail with news that would shift the ground beneath Ezra's carefully constructed solitude. The young man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, but his face carried an excitement that made him seem even younger than his 26 years. "Mr. McKinnon, I've got news." Jake's grin was infectious as he tied his horse to the porch rail. "I'm getting married." The announcement hit Ezra with unexpected force. In the 7 years since Clara's departure, Jake had become something like a son to him, the closest thing to family he'd allowed himself. The thought of the young man taking a wife brought a complex mix of joy and something that felt uncomfortably like envy. "That's wonderful news, Jake. Who's the lucky woman?" "Rebecca Hartley, Tom Hartley's youngest daughter. We've been stepping out for the better part of a year, and I finally worked up the courage to ask her father for her hand." Jake's expression grew thoughtful. She's everything I could want in a wife. Kind, smart, strong enough for ranch life, but gentle enough to make a house feel like home. Ezra invited Jake inside for coffee, going through the motions of hospitality while his mind struggled with the unexpected emotions the news had stirred. As they sat at his rough-hewn table, Jake continued talking about wedding plans and the small cabin he was building on the edge of the Hartley spread. "The thing is," Jake said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, "Rebecca asked me something that got me thinking. She wanted to know about my family, about the people who'd been important to me. When I told her about you, about how you taught me to read the mountains and weather and all the practical things a man needs to know out here, she said she'd like to meet you. Jake, I appreciate the thought, but she said something else, too." Jake's brown eyes were serious now. "She said that love makes a person want to share their joy with the people who matter to them. Made me realize that you matter to me, Mr. McKinnon, more than I probably ever said." The simple statement of affection caught Ezra off guard. In the years since Sarah's death, he'd convinced himself that emotional distance was a form of strength, that needing people was a weakness he couldn't afford. But Jake's words revealed the poverty of that philosophy. "You matter to me too, son," Ezra said quietly, using the endearment he'd never spoken aloud before. "More than you know." Jake's smile brightened the dim cabin like sunlight. "Then you'll come to the wedding? It's next month, right after the spring roundup. Rebecca's already planning where everyone will sit, and she's saved a place at the family table for you." The invitation represented everything Ezra had avoided for years. Community, celebration, the messy complications of caring about people and allowing them to care for him in return. But looking at Jake's expectant face, he found it impossible to refuse. "I'll be there," he promised, and meant it. After Jake left, Ezra sat on his porch with the walking stick in his hands, running his thumb over the notches he'd carved. Each small indentation represented a memory he'd allowed himself to examine. Moments with Sarah, conversations with Clara, the slow building of friendship with Jake and the Henleys. 7 years of solitude had taught him that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another form of dying. The wedding took place on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming in the meadow behind the small church and mountains standing sentinel over the valley. Ezra had ridden down from his cabin wearing his best clothes, a black suit that still fit despite the years of mountain living, his father's pocket watch, and boots polished to a military shine. Rebecca Hartley proved to be everything Jake had claimed and more. She was petite and dark-haired, with intelligent brown eyes and a smile that suggested both strength and warmth. When Jake introduced them after the ceremony, she took Ezra's weathered hands in her small ones, without hesitation. "Mr. McKinnon, Jake has told me so much about you. Thank you for being such a good friend to him." "Jake's a fine young man," Ezra replied. "You're getting a good husband." "I know I am." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "And he's getting a friend who taught him that being strong doesn't mean being alone." The reception was held in the church hall, with tables laden with food and a fiddle player providing music for dancing. Ezra found himself seated between Doc Henley, recovered from his heart troubles, but moving more slowly, and Martha, who seemed determined to ensure he didn't retreat to the edges of the celebration. "Look at them," Martha said, nodding toward Jake and Rebecca as they waltzed to a gentle tune. "That's what happiness looks like. Ezra, that's what two people can build when they're brave enough to love each other." Ezra watched the young couple move together with the easy grace of people who'd found their perfect match. Jake's face was soft with adoration, while Rebecca's eyes never left his. They moved as if they were the only two people in the room, lost in their own private joy. "They're very young," Ezra observed, though without the bitter edge the words might have carried years earlier. "They are," Martha agreed. "But youth isn't a requirement for love, Ezra. It's just one way to experience it." As the evening progressed, Ezra found himself drawn into conversations he'd avoided for years. He talked with other ranchers about weather and cattle prices, listened to wives discuss their children and gardens, and even accepted an invitation to dance from Mrs. Patterson, the banker's widow. "You're a fine dancer for a mountain hermit," she teased as they moved through a simple waltz. "My wife taught me," Ezra replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "She said every man should know how to make a woman feel graceful." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "Sarah was a lovely woman. She'd be pleased to see you among people again." As the evening wound down, Jake pulled Ezra aside for a private word. The young man's face was flushed with joy and perhaps a glass or two of celebratory whiskey. But his eyes were serious. "Mr. McKinnon, there's something I want to say, and I may not get another chance with all the excitement of starting married life." "What's on your mind, son?" "You saved me, you know. After my pa died, I was angry and lost and heading toward trouble. You gave me something to focus on, taught me skills that made me valuable to the Hartley Ranch. But more than that, you showed me that a man could be strong without being hard, that he could stand alone without being lonely." Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. "But watching Rebecca tonight, seeing how she lights up when she looks at me, I realize something. Love doesn't make a man weak. It makes him better, stronger, more than he could be on his own." The words hung in the mountain air like a challenge. Ezra looked at the young man who'd become like a son to him and saw wisdom that transcended his years. "You're going to be a good husband, Jake?" "I hope so. And I hope someday you'll remember that it's never too late to be a good one yourself." The ride back to his cabin took place under a blanket of stars, with the sounds of celebration fading behind him as his horse climbed the familiar trail. But instead of the usual weight of returning solitude, Ezra felt something different, a restless energy that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the ride. At his cabin, he sat on the porch with his walking stick, tracing the carved notches in the darkness. Each small indentation told a story, marked a moment when he'd allowed himself to feel something other than the protective numbness he'd cultivated for so long. 7 years had passed since Clara's promise, and 3 remained. 3 years to decide if Jake was right about love making a man stronger, or if Ezra's fears about age and loss were insurmountable truths. In the distance, an owl called from the pine trees, its voice carrying across the valley like a question waiting for an answer. For the first time in years, Ezra found himself wanting to respond. 9 years had passed since Clara Whitmore promised to wait, and autumn had come to the San Juan Mountains with a fierce beauty that made the air itself seem to burn. Ezra stood on his porch, watching the aspen groves blaze gold against the evergreen slopes, when he saw Martha Henley's familiar figure climbing the trail toward his cabin. But something about her posture was different, urgent in a way that made his chest tighten with apprehension. She carried a letter in her hand, and even from a distance, he could see the careful script that marked it as something official, something that would change things. "Ezra," Martha called as she approached, slightly breathless from the climb. "I have news. Important news." He helped her onto the porch and fetched water while she caught her breath. The letter lay on the small table between them like an unexploded charge, its cream-colored envelope bearing a California postmark and Clara's familiar handwriting. "She's coming back," Martha said without preamble. "Clara's coming home." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. 9 years of careful equilibrium, the delicate balance he'd struck between memory and hope, between isolation and connection, suddenly tilted beneath his feet. "When?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. 2 weeks. "She's written to say she's taking the train to Denver, then the stage to Cedar Ridge." Martha's eyes searched his face with the keen attention of a woman who'd spent decades reading the emotions people tried to hide. "She's coming to take care of her Aunt Millicent. The old woman's health is failing." Ezra stared at the letter, afraid to touch it, afraid to learn what other revelations it might contain. "Is that all? Just to care for her aunt?" "That's what the letter says." Martha paused meaningfully. "But Ezra, you should know, she's not the same girl who left here 9 years ago. She's become something remarkable in California, head teacher at one of Sacramento's finest schools, respected throughout the community. She's had offers of marriage from men of standing, opportunities to travel east and continue her education, and she turned them down. Every one of them. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. She's 27 years old now, Ezra, a woman of accomplishment and independence. If she's coming back, it's because she chooses to, not because she has no other options. The implications of Martha's words settled over Ezra like mountain mist. Clara wasn't returning as the desperate young woman he'd rejected 9 years ago. She was coming back as someone who'd built a life for herself, someone who could choose her own path. I can't see her, Martha. I can't face her after what I said, after how I sent her away. Can't or won't. Martha's tone carried the authority of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. Because there's a difference, Ezra McKinnon, and it's time you learned to tell one from the other. That night, Ezra barely slept. He paced his cabin like a caged animal, picking up objects and setting them down without purpose, starting tasks only to abandon them moments later. The carefully ordered life he'd built on the mountain suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. By morning, he'd made a decision that terrified him more than facing down a wounded bear. He would leave, pack his essential belongings, load his horse, and disappear deeper into the mountains where no one could find him. It was cowardly, but it was also practical. Clara could return to Cedar Ridge, care for her aunt, and rebuild whatever life she chose without the complication of his presence. Jake Morrison arrived as Ezra was loading his saddlebags, and the young man's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he realized what was happening. Mr. McKinnon, what in the hell do you think you're doing? Language, Jake. Your wife wouldn't approve. Ezra continued packing with determined efficiency. I'm going deeper into the mountains for a while. Check on some old trap lines, maybe winter up near Beaver Creek. Like hell you are. Jake's voice carried a steel that Ezra had never heard before. You're running away. I'm being practical. You're being a coward. Jake stepped between Ezra and his horse, his young face set with determination. For 9 years, I've watched you torture yourself over that woman. 9 years of carrying her memory like a stone in your chest. And now that she's coming back, you want to run? Jake, you don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand that you've convinced yourself you're too old for her, too set in your ways, too broken by loss to deserve happiness. Jake's brown eyes blazed with protective fury. But you know what I think. I think you're just scared. The accusation hung in the crisp mountain air like a challenge. Ezra wanted to deny it, to explain the complex calculus of age and propriety that made his feelings for Clara impossible. But looking at Jake's earnest face, he found he couldn't summon the words. Of course I'm scared, he said finally. She's 27 years old, Jake. Accomplished, educated, beautiful. She could have anyone she wants. Why would she choose a mountain hermit pushing 60? Maybe because she already did choose you 9 years ago, and nothing that's happened since has changed her mind. Jake's voice softened slightly. Maybe because love isn't about what makes sense on paper, but about what feels right in your heart. Before Ezra could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Doc Henley rode into the clearing, followed by his son Peter, a serious young man who'd inherited his father's medical practice and his mother's practical wisdom. Ezra, Doc called as he dismounted with careful movements, heard you might be planning a trip to the high country. Word travels fast. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, everything travels fast. Doc's eyes took in the packed saddlebags and Ezra's defensive posture. Mind if we sit and talk for a minute? These old bones don't take kindly to long rides anymore. They settled on the porch. Jake, the 2 Henleys, and Ezra, while the morning sun painted the valley below in shades of gold and amber. Doc was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts with the deliberation of a man who'd learned to weigh his words carefully. Ezra, in all the years I've known you, I've watched you make exactly one decision based on fear instead of wisdom. You sent that girl away 9 years ago because you were afraid of what people would say, afraid of the difference in your ages, afraid of losing someone you loved. Doc, let me finish. The old doctor's voice carried the authority of someone who'd delivered difficult truths for 4 decades. Now she's coming back, and you're about to make the same mistake again. You're going to run because you're afraid. She's too good for you. Afraid you'll disappoint her. Afraid she'll realize she made a mistake. Doc leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. But here's what you're not considering, son. What if she's coming back because she knows exactly what she wants? What if 9 years of living in the world has taught her that what you have to offer, stability, wisdom, the kind of love that's been tested by time, is worth more than youth and promises? She could have any man she wants, Ezra said quietly. Yes, she could, and apparently the man she wants is you. Peter Henley spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the calm certainty of his medical training. Mr. McKinnon, I've known Clara since she was a girl. She's not the type to make impulsive decisions or chase romantic fantasies. If she's coming back, it's because she's thought it through and decided that Cedar Ridge is where she belongs. And if you run, Jake added, you'll be making that decision for her instead of letting her make it for herself. The weight of their combined wisdom pressed down on Ezra like mountain stone. 4 men sitting on a porch, debating the mathematics of the heart. It would have been absurd if it weren't so desperately important. What am I supposed to say to her? Ezra asked finally. How do I explain 9 years of silence? How do I apologize? For sending her away? You start with the truth. Martha Henley's voice came from the trail. She'd climbed the mountain again, this time accompanied by Rebecca Morrison, Jake's wife of 2 years. The truth is simple, Ezra, Martha continued as she joined them on the porch. You were afraid. Afraid of loving someone and losing them. Afraid of not being worthy of her devotion. Afraid of all the ways that loving someone makes a person vulnerable. But fear isn't a sin. Acting on it when you know better is. Rebecca spoke softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of a woman who'd learned to love without reservation. Mr. McKinnon, when Jake proposed to me, I was terrified of giving. My heart to someone who might leave, might change, might decide I wasn't enough. But you know what I realized? The only thing worse than loving someone and losing them is never loving them at all. As the sun climbed toward noon, the little group on Ezra's porch fell into thoughtful silence. Below them, the valley stretched, green and gold, with Cedar Ridge nestled like a collection of children's toys beside the winding creek. 1 week, Ezra said finally. She'll be here in 1 week. 1 week to decide if you're going to meet the future or hide from it, Doc said gently. 1 week to remember that love isn't about deserving. It's about having the courage to accept a gift freely given, Martha added. 1 week to stop being afraid and start being the man she believed you could be, Jake concluded. That evening, after his friends had departed, Ezra sat alone on his porch with Clara's letter in his hands. He'd finally worked up the courage to read it, and its contents were both simpler and more complex than he'd expected. She was coming home to care for her aunt, yes, but woven through her careful, proper words was something else, a thread of hope so delicate he almost missed it. She asked after the mountain people, mentioned that she often thought of Cedar Ridge and wondered if it had changed. She closed with a postscript that made his chest tight. I hope the mountain air is still as clear as I remember, and that the people I care about are well and happy. 9 years had passed since her promise. 1 year remained. Ezra folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Clara's stone on the porch rail. Tomorrow, he would begin the hardest task of his life, learning to believe that he might be worthy of the love she'd offered so freely, so long ago. Clara Whitmore stepped down from the Denver stage on a crisp October morning, and Ezra McKinnon felt the carefully constructed foundations of his world shift beneath his feet. From his position outside Hartley's general store, where he'd been pretending to examine harness leather for the better part of an hour, he watched her emerge into the mountain sunlight like something from a half-remembered dream. She was no longer the 18-year-old girl who'd climbed his mountain 9 years ago. This was a woman in the fullest sense of the word, poised, elegant, wearing a traveling dress of deep blue wool that spoke of prosperity and refinement. Her honey-colored hair was arranged in a sophisticated style beneath a hat that had clearly come from a city milliner, and she moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to respect and attention. But it was her eyes that stopped Ezra's breath. Those same mountain sky blue eyes that had haunted his solitude for 9 years, now set in a face that had lost its girlish softness and gained something far more compelling. The quiet strength of a woman who had tested herself against the world and emerged victorious. "Clara!" Martha Henley's voice rang across the small town square as she hurried to embrace the returning daughter of Cedar Ridge. "Oh, my dear girl, look at you. You're more beautiful than ever." Clara's smile was warm and genuine as she returned Martha's embrace, but Ezra noticed something else in her expression, a reserve that hadn't been there before, a careful composure that suggested she'd learned to guard her emotions. "Mrs. Henley, it's so good to see you. How is Dr. Henley and everyone else?" Clara's voice had deepened slightly, gained a cultured cadence that spoke of years spent among educated people. "Everyone's fine, dear. Eager to see you, of course. The whole town's been talking about your return." Martha glanced meaningfully in Ezra's direction, but Clara seemed not to notice. As the crowd gathered to welcome Cedar Ridge's most successful daughter home, Ezra found himself studying Clara with the intensity of a man trying to reconcile memory with reality. This accomplished woman bore little resemblance to the earnest girl who'd confessed her love on his mountain. She fielded questions about her life in California with easy charm, spoke knowledgeably about educational reforms and literature, and accepted congratulations on her achievements with gracious humility. "Miss Whitmore," young Tommy Morrison stepped forward with his hat in his hands, "I just wanted to say how proud we all are of what you've accomplished out in California. Cedar Ridge always knew you were destined for great things." Clara's smile was kind but distant. "Thank you, Tommy. It's good to see you again. I heard tell you turned down a position at some fancy school back east." Mrs. Patterson chimed in with the directness of a woman who'd never learned to mind her own business. "True? I've received several offers over the years," Clara replied diplomatically. "But family obligations must come first. Aunt Millicent needs care, and Cedar Ridge is my home." The word home hung in the air with a weight that made Ezra's chest tighten. But as he watched Clara navigate the welcoming crowd, he began to understand that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't the love-struck girl returning to claim her promise. This was a successful woman making a practical decision about family duty. The revelation should have brought relief. Instead, it filled him with a hollow ache he couldn't name. "Mr. McKinnon." Clara's voice cut through his brooding, and he looked up to find her standing before him, her expression politely cordial. "How good to see you again." The formal address hit him like a slap. No warmth, no recognition of their shared history, just the courteous acknowledgement one might give to any casual acquaintance. "Miss Whitmore." He touched the brim of his hat, struggling to match her tone. "Welcome home." "Thank you." Her eyes met his briefly, and he searched for some flicker of the girl who'd once promised to wait 10 years for him. But he found only the polite attention of a woman making conversation with a neighbor. "I trust the mountain air hasn't changed too much in my absence?" "No, ma'am. Mountains don't change much." "No, I suppose they don't." There was something almost wistful in her tone. But before he could analyze it further, she'd turned away to greet other well-wishers. Over the following days, Ezra found himself riding into town more frequently than he had in years, drawn by a fascination he couldn't name and couldn't resist. Clara had taken rooms above the millinery shop while she arranged her aunt's care, and Cedar Ridge buzzed with stories of her accomplishments. She'd been head teacher at the Sacramento Female Seminary, one of California's most prestigious schools. She'd written articles on educational reform that had been published in San Francisco newspapers. She'd been courted by a successful lawyer, a prosperous merchant, and even a state legislator, all of whom she'd politely declined. More importantly for Ezra's peace of mind, she showed no inclination to seek him out or acknowledge their shared past. When they encountered each other on the street or in the general store, her manner was consistently pleasant but distant, the kind of cordial indifference she might show to any acquaintance from her youth. It was during one of these chance encounters that the first crack appeared in Clara's composed facade. Ezra was leaving the post office when he nearly collided with her on the wooden sidewalk. As he reached out to steady her, their hands touched for the briefest moment, and he saw something flicker across her face, a flash of the old Clara, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. "Forgive me," she said, stepping back with careful precision. "I wasn't watching where I was going. No harm done." He studied her face, looking for another glimpse of whatever he'd seen. "How is your aunt faring?" "As well as can be expected. Dr. Henley has been very kind." Clara adjusted her shawl with nervous fingers, a gesture he remembered from their younger days. "The mountain air seems to be helping her spirits, if not her health." "That's good to hear." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people who'd once shared the most intimate of conversations, now struggling to find common ground. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope you've been well. Mr. McKinnon, Martha mentioned that you've been helping in town more often these past few years. He wanted to say more, to bridge the careful distance she'd constructed between them. But her manner discouraged familiarity. "That's good. Community is important." She paused, and for a moment he thought she might say something more personal. Instead, she simply nodded. "I should return to Aunt Millicent." "Good day." As she walked away, Ezra noticed the medal pinned to her coat lapel, a small gold ornament he hadn't seen before. When he asked Martha about it later, her explanation left him reeling. "Oh, that's her teaching medal. She received it from the California State Educational Board for excellence in instruction. Quite an honor, I'm told. They don't give those to just anyone." The medal represented everything Clara had accomplished in her 9 years away: recognition, respect, professional achievement. She'd built a life of substance and meaning, earned accolades that spoke to her intelligence and dedication. The gap between them had grown wider, not narrower, during their years apart. It was this realization that struck Ezra like lightning on his mountain one evening as he sat with Clara's stone in his palm. He'd spent 9 years assuming that if she returned, it would be as the same earnest girl who'd confessed her love. Instead, she'd returned as someone who'd outgrown the need for his approval or affection. The plot twist was both elegant and devastating. Clara hadn't come back for him at all. She'd come back in spite of him, choosing family duty over personal desire, choosing the familiar comfort of home over the accomplished life she'd built elsewhere, and perhaps most painful of all, she'd grown into exactly the kind of woman he'd always believed she deserved to become: successful, independent, worthy of far more than a mountain hermit could offer, the promise she'd made 9 years ago to wait 10 years for him to decide if love was worth the risk. Suddenly seemed like the foolish dream of a young girl who hadn't yet learned what she was capable of, achieving on her own. Ezra closed his fingers around the smooth stone and faced a truth more complex than any he'd grappled with during his years of solitude. Clara Whitmore had kept her promise by growing beyond the need for it to be fulfilled, and he wasn't sure whether to be proud of her strength or devastated by his loss. 3 weeks after Clara's return, Ezra McKinnon sat at his rough-hewn table with a piece of paper before him, the stub of a pencil worn smooth between his fingers. The words came slowly, painfully, like drawing water from a stone well. He'd started the letter 17 times, each attempt ending in frustration and crumpled paper cast into the fireplace. The 18th attempt began simply, "Dear Clara." Even that much felt presumptuous. What right did he have to address her with such familiarity when she'd made it clear their relationship was to be one of polite acquaintanceship? But the formal Miss Whitmore felt like a betrayal of everything they'd once meant to each other. Outside his cabin, November wind rattled the windows and sent the last autumn leaves skittering across his porch. Winter was coming early to the mountains, and with it the kind of isolation that would make his current loneliness seem like a fond memory. If he was going to act, if he was going to risk the careful equilibrium Clara had established between them, it had to be soon. The letter grew slowly, each sentence a small act of courage. I know I have no right to write to you after the way I sent you away 9 years ago. I know you've built a life that doesn't need my apologies or explanations. But watching you these past weeks, seeing the remarkable woman you've become, I find I can't stay silent any longer. I was wrong. Not just about sending you away, though that was cruel and cowardly. I was wrong about everything, about age, about worthiness, about love itself. I told myself I was protecting you from the pain of loving an older man. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the risk of losing someone again. You've accomplished more in 9 years than most people do in a lifetime. You've earned respect, recognition, independence, all the things I knew you were capable of when you were 18. Watching you now, I understand that my fears weren't about your youth or my age. They were about my own cowardice. The words flowed easier now. Years of unspoken thoughts finally finding expression. I love you. Clara, I loved you when you were 18 and foolish enough to climb my mountain and confess your feelings to a broken hermit. I love you now that you're 27 and wise enough to know your own worth. I've loved you through 9 years of silence and regret, through every sunrise I watched alone and every evening I spent wondering what might have been. I don't expect you to return those feelings. I don't expect anything at all. I simply needed you to know that your love, the gift you offered so freely 9 years ago, wasn't wasted on someone too stupid to recognize its value. It sustained me through the loneliest years of my life, even when I was too proud to admit it. If you choose to return to California, to the life you've built there, I'll understand. You deserve every happiness, every success, every dream fulfilled. But if some small part of you still remembers the promise you made on my mountain, if you still believe that love can weather any storm, then know that I'm finally ready to stop being afraid. The 10 years you gave me are almost up. I've spent 9 of them learning to live without you, and 1 trying to figure out how to live with you again. The mathematics are still complicated. I'm 57 now, and you're 27. That gap will never disappear. But perhaps love isn't about arithmetic after all. Perhaps it's about 2 people deciding that whatever time they have together is better than the time they'd spend apart. Ezra read the letter through twice, each word a small blade turning in his chest. It was honest, vulnerable, everything he'd been too afraid to say when it might have mattered. Now it felt like too little, too late. The desperate gamble of a man who'd realized his mistake only after the prize had been lost. But before he could lose his nerve, he folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. The ride to town took longer than usual, his horse picking its way carefully down the icy trail while Ezra's stomach twisted with anticipation and dread. Cedar Ridge was bustling with pre-winter activity, folks stocking up on supplies, securing livestock, preparing for the harsh months ahead. But Ezra barely noticed the familiar bustle. His attention was focused entirely on the millinery shop where Clara had taken rooms, its windows glowing warmly in the late afternoon light. He'd almost reached the shop when Jake Morrison intercepted him, appearing from the feed store with the quick step of a man bearing urgent news. "Mr. McKinnon, thank God I found you. There's something you need to know about Clara." The young man's expression was grave, and Ezra felt his stomach drop. "What is it? Is she all right?" "She's fine, but—" Jake glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. Robert Drummond arrived on the morning stage. The merchant from Denver who's been courting her. The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd heard talk of Drummond, a successful businessman in his 30s, handsome and well-connected. The kind of man any sensible woman would consider a perfect match. "He's staying at the hotel," Jake continued, "and word is he's planning to propose. Tonight at the church social. The church social." Ezra had forgotten about the monthly gathering, though Martha had mentioned it several times. The whole town would be there, dressed in their finest clothes, enjoying music and fellowship and watching Robert Drummond make Clara Whitmore the offer of a lifetime. Jake, Ezra's hand moved unconsciously to the letter in his pocket, the words he'd labored over suddenly seeming painfully inadequate. I don't know what to do. You fight for her. Jake's voice was fierce with conviction. You stop hiding behind fear and good intentions, and you fight for the woman you love. She doesn't love me anymore, Jake. She's made that clear. Has she? Or have you just convinced yourself of that, because it's easier than taking a risk? Jake stepped closer, his brown eyes blazing with the passion of youth. Mr. McKinnon, I've watched that woman for 3 weeks. I've seen how she looks when your name comes up in conversation, how she finds excuses to walk past the general store when she thinks you might be there. That's not indifference. Then why? Because she's protecting herself, same as you've been doing. Because 9 years ago you broke her heart, and she's not about to hand you the pieces again unless she's sure you won't drop them. The observation struck Ezra with the force of revelation. Of course Clara would be guarded, careful, distant. She'd offered her heart once and been rejected. Why would she risk that kind of pain again without some sign that things had changed? The church social starts at 7, Jake said, checking his pocket watch. That gives you 3 hours to figure out what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Because if you let Robert Drummond propose to her without speaking your piece, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. As Jake walked away, Ezra stood in the middle of Cedar Ridge's main street, feeling the weight of 9 years' worth of mistakes pressing down on him like mountain stone. The letter in his pocket suddenly seemed inadequate, too private, too safe, too easily ignored or dismissed. If he was going to fight for Clara, it couldn't be with written words that she could read in solitude and reject in privacy. It had to be public, honest, vulnerable in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. It had to be at the church social, in front of the entire town, with Robert Drummond watching, and Clara forced to make a choice that would define both their futures. The prospect terrified him more than facing down a wounded grizzly bear. But as he thought of Clara's polite distance, her careful composure, the medal on her coat that spoke of achievements he could never match, Ezra realized that terror was just another form of cowardice. He'd spent 9 years being afraid of loss, afraid of inadequacy, afraid of taking the kind of risks that made life worth living. Tonight, if he could find the courage, he would stop being afraid and start being the man Clara had believed he could become. The church bell tower showed 5 o'clock. 2 hours until the social began. 2 hours until Robert Drummond made his play for the woman Ezra had been too foolish to claim when he had the chance. 2 hours to prepare for the most important battle of his life, not against other men or mountain dangers, but against his own fears and the terrible arithmetic of time lost and love deferred. Ezra touched the letter in his pocket one more time, then turned toward home. He had preparations to make. The Cedar Ridge Church Hall blazed with lamplight and rang with the sound of fiddle music when Ezra McKinnon stepped through the doorway at 7:30. He'd spent 2 hours preparing, not just his appearance, though he'd shaved carefully and donned his best black suit, but his resolve. The letter remained in his pocket, but tonight called for spoken words, for the kind of public declaration that would leave no room for retreat. The hall was crowded with familiar faces, farmers and ranchers and townsfolk dressed in their finest clothes, creating the warm buzz of a community celebrating together. Tables laden with food lined one wall, while couples moved through the figures of a country dance to the cheerful strains of Samuel Hart's violin. And there, near the refreshment table, stood Robert Drummond. Ezra recognized him immediately, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from success and social position. He was perhaps 35, handsome in the way that spoke of good breeding and easy living, his dark hair perfectly groomed and his clothes clearly tailored by skilled hands. But it was the woman beside him who captured and held Ezra's attention. Clara wore a dress of deep emerald silk that brought out the color of her eyes, her honey-colored hair arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. She looked every inch the accomplished woman she'd become, poised, beautiful, worthy of any man's devotion. As Ezra watched from the doorway, Drummond leaned close to speak in Clara's ear, and she smiled in response, a polite, careful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Whatever the merchant was saying, it was receiving the kind of courteous attention Clara had perfected during her years in California society. Ezra! Martha Henley's voice cut through his observation, and he turned to find her approaching with Doc at her side. "I'm so glad you decided to come. It's been far too long since we've seen you at a social gathering." "Martha, Doc." Ezra touched the brim of his hat, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his chest. "Fine evening for a dance?" "Indeed it is." Doc's eyes followed Ezra's gaze toward Clara and Drummond. "I see you've noticed our distinguished visitor from Denver. Quite the successful gentleman from what I hear." Martha shot her husband a warning look. "Samuel, mind your tongue. Just making conversation, dear." Doc's expression was innocent, but Ezra caught the gleam of mischief in his eyes. "Though I will say success isn't everything. Character matters more than coin, in my experience." Before Ezra could respond, the fiddle music changed to a waltz, and he watched Robert Drummond extend his hand to Clara with practiced gallantry. She accepted with gracious composure, and they moved onto the dance floor with the easy elegance of two people accustomed to society's pleasures. They made a handsome couple. There was no denying that. Drummond led with confidence. Clara followed with grace, and half the room watched with approving smiles. Here was a match that made sense, a union that would satisfy every practical consideration. But as Ezra watched Clara's face during the dance, he noticed something that gave him hope, despite his fears. Her smile remained polite but distant, her eyes held no warmth for her partner, and her posture spoke of duty rather than desire. She was going through the motions of courtship with the same careful composure she'd shown him, pleasant but remote. Engaging but uncommitted. "She doesn't love him," Martha said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Martha, "Oh, she's being perfectly proper about his attentions." Clara's far too well-mannered to discourage a suitor rudely. "But a woman doesn't look at a man she loves the way she's looking at Mr. Drummond." The waltz ended, and Ezra watched Drummond escort Clara to the edge of the dance floor, where several other couples had gathered. Even from across the room, he could see the merchant speaking earnestly, his expression serious in a way that made Ezra's stomach clench with apprehension. "Jake was right," Doc said suddenly. "If you're going to act, it has to be tonight." Ezra turned to stare at the older man. "Jake told you?" "Jake told everyone who'd listen. Half the town knows you're sweet on Clara Whitmore, and the other half has been hoping you'd finally work up the courage to do something about it." Doc's voice was gentle but firm. "The question is, are you going to let fear make this decision for you again?" Before Ezra could answer, he saw Drummond take Clara's hand and begin leading her toward a quieter corner of the hall. The merchant's intention was clear. He was preparing to make his proposal, to offer Clara the kind of secure, respectable future that any sensible woman would accept. "Excuse me," Ezra said, his decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. He crossed the crowded hall with determined strides, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Conversations paused as people noticed his approach, and by the time he reached Clara and Drummond, a significant portion of the room was watching with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Drummond," Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space, "I wonder if I might have a word with Miss Whitmore." Drummond's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "I'm afraid Miss Whitmore and I were having a private conversation, Mr. McKinnon." Ezra McKinnon. He kept his eyes on Clara's face, watching for some sign of her feelings. "And I'm afraid my business with Miss Whitmore can't wait." "Ezra." Clara's voice was carefully neutral, but he caught a flash of something in her eyes, surprise, apprehension, and perhaps the faintest hint of hope. "What is it?" "I need to ask you something. Something I should have asked 9 years ago." He was dimly aware that the entire hall had fallen silent, that every eye was fixed on the three of them. But the only face that mattered was Clara's. "Mr. McKinnon," Drummond interjected, his voice sharp with irritation. "Surely this can wait until a more appropriate time." "No," Ezra said quietly, finally turning to meet the merchant's gaze. "It can't. I've waited 9 years already. And I won't wait another minute." He reached into his pocket and pulled out Clara's stone, the smooth river rock. She'd left on his porch rail that September day when she'd promised to wait 10 years for him to overcome his fears. "Clara," he said, holding the stone where she could see it, "do you remember this?" The sight of the stone in Ezra's weathered palm hit Clara like lightning. For 9 years, she'd wondered if he'd kept it or thrown it away in disgust. Seeing it now, worn smooth by his handling, she felt the careful composure she'd built around her heart begin to crack. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the collective-held breath of the watching crowd. "I remember. You said it had weathered every storm the mountain could throw at it and come out smooth and strong." Ezra continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "You said that's what real love does. It endures." Robert Drummond stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Miss Whitmore, surely you don't have to tolerate this interruption. Mr. McKinnon, I must insist." "You must insist on nothing." Clara's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. For the first time since her return, the careful mask of polite society fell away, revealing the fire that had always burned beneath her composed surface. "Mr. McKinnon has something to say, and I intend to hear it." Ezra took a step closer, the stone cradled in his palm like a sacred relic. "Clara, 9 years ago you told me you'd wait 10 years for me to decide if I was too old or just too afraid. You gave me that time, and I wasted most of it convincing myself I was protecting you from making a mistake." The hall was so quiet that the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth sounded like rifle shots. Every face was turned toward them, but Clara saw only Ezra's eyes, grey as mountain storms, filled with a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not about the difference in our ages, that's real and it always will be. But I was wrong about everything else. Wrong to think that love was about deserving instead of accepting. Wrong to believe that fear was wisdom. Wrong to send away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too proud to admit I needed it." Clara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. 9 years of carefully suppressed hope rising in her chest like floodwater. "Ezra, let me finish. Please." He took another step closer, close enough that she could see the slight tremor in his hands, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed his nervousness. "I love you, Clara. I loved you when you were 18 and brave enough to risk your heart on a stubborn mountain man. I love you now that you're 27 and accomplished enough to have any life you choose." He held up the stone, its surface catching the lamplight. "You were right about this. It did endure every storm, just like your love endured my stupidity and fear. I've carried it with me every day for 9 years, and every time I looked at it, I remembered that someone once believed I was worth loving." The tears came then, sliding down Clara's cheeks, despite her efforts to maintain dignity. Around them, she was dimly aware of the crowd, some faces showing disapproval at the public display, others soft with romantic sympathy. But none of that mattered now. "I don't expect you to still feel the same way," Ezra said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 9 years is a long time, and you've built a life that doesn't need my approval or participation. But before you accept Mr. Drummond's proposal, and I can see that's what he's planning, I needed you to know that the love you offered wasn't wasted. It kept me alive through the loneliest years of my life. How dare you?" Drummond exploded, finally finding his voice. "Miss Whitmore, I won't stand here and watch this mountain hermit make a spectacle of you. You're a lady of refinement and accomplishment. Surely you can see that this is beneath your dignity." Clara turned to face Drummond, and the look in her eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Drummond, you're absolutely right about one thing. I'm a woman of accomplishment. I've built a career, earned respect, proven my independence. And do you know what all of that has taught me? She paused, looking around the silent hall before returning her gaze to Drummond's flushed face. It's taught me that success without love is just a prettier form of loneliness. It's taught me that I can live perfectly well without a man's protection or approval. And most importantly, it's taught me to recognize the difference between what the world thinks I should want and what my heart actually needs. She turned back to Ezra, whose face had gone pale with hope and terror. You want to know if I still love you after 9 years? The answer is yes. Yes, despite the way you sent me away. Yes, despite the years of silence. Yes, despite every rational reason why I should have forgotten you and moved on. A collective gasp rose from the watching crowd, but Clara ignored it completely. But I need to know something too, Ezra McKinnon. Are you asking me to love you because you're finally ready to love me back? Or are you asking because you can't bear the thought of me loving someone else? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Ezra felt the weight of every eye in the hall upon him. This was the moment, the fulcrum on which both their futures would turn. He could give her pretty words about redemption and growth, or he could give her the truth. Both, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you, and I'm terrified of watching you build one without me. I'm asking because 9 years of trying to forget you has only proven that some things are too important to let pride destroy. He stepped closer still, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her blue eyes, smell the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her hair. But mostly I'm asking because I finally understand what you tried to tell me 9 years ago. Love isn't about arithmetic or propriety or what makes sense on paper. It's about two people deciding that whatever time they have together is better than the time they'd spend apart. Clara reached out and took the stone from his palm, her fingers brushing his with a touch that sent electricity up his arm. 10 years, she said softly. That's what I promised you. It's been 9 years and 2 months. I know. I kept my promise, Ezra, even when it seemed foolish, even when my friends in California told me I was wasting my youth on a man who'd never have the courage to claim me. I kept it because I believed, her voice broke slightly, I believed that real love was worth waiting for. She closed her fingers around the stone, holding it tight against her heart. So here's my question for you. Are you finally ready to stop being afraid? Are you ready to accept that love isn't about what we deserve, but about what we're brave enough to reach for? Ezra looked into her eyes, those mountain sky blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for 9 years, and felt the last of his fear fall away like autumn leaves. Yes, he said simply. I'm ready. And then, in front of the entire population of Cedar Ridge, with Robert Drummond sputtering his outrage and Martha Henley weeping with joy, Ezra McKinnon took Clara Whitmore in his arms and kissed her with 9 years' worth of suppressed longing and hard-won wisdom. The promise stone fell from Clara's fingers and rolled across the wooden floor, but neither of them noticed. They had better things to hold on to now. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the meadow behind Cedar Ridge's small church as the entire town gathered to witness something they'd waited nearly a decade to see. Clara Whitmore, resplendent in her mother's wedding dress of ivory silk, stood beside Ezra McKinnon beneath an arch of wildflowers and pine boughs, their hands joined as firmly as their hearts. Doc Henley, his health much improved since the autumn, performed the ceremony with the dignity of a man who'd watched 2 stubborn people finally find their way to each other. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of 2 souls who have proven that love, like the mountains themselves, endures all seasons." Ezra wore his father's best suit, carefully mended and pressed, with Sarah's Bible in his coat pocket, not as a burden from the past, but as a blessing for the future. The pressed flowers had finally crumbled to dust, but their memory had transformed from pain into gratitude for a love that had taught him how to love again. Clara's eyes shone with tears of joy as she spoke her vows, her voice clear and strong, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Ezra, 9 years ago, I promised to wait for you to overcome your fears. Today I promise to walk beside you as we face whatever fears the future may bring. I choose you, not because I need you, but because loving you makes me more than I could ever be alone." When it came time for Ezra to speak, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he held Clara's fingers. "Clara, I spent 30 years believing I was too old for love, too set in my ways for happiness, too broken by loss to risk my heart again. You taught me that love isn't about age or circumstance, it's about courage. The courage to accept a gift freely given, the courage to believe in tomorrow despite yesterday's sorrows, the courage to trust that some promises are worth keeping even when they seem impossible." He paused, looking out over the assembled crowd, Jake and Rebecca Morrison with their infant son, Martha Henley dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the farmers and ranchers and townspeople who'd become his community despite his years of isolation. "I promise to love you with whatever years I have left, whether they be 10 or 30 or 50. I promise to share my strength with you and draw strength from you in return. And I promise never again to let fear make my decisions for me." As Doc pronounced them husband and wife, the meadow erupted in cheers and applause. But for Ezra and Clara, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Two people who'd learned that the best love stories aren't about young passion but about mature hearts. Brave enough to reach for happiness, the reception was held in the meadow itself, with tables groaning under the weight of food prepared by every woman in the territory, and a fiddle player who seemed determined to keep the dancing going until dawn. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Ezra found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching his new wife laugh with Martha Henley while children chased fireflies between the tables. "Quite a change from the hermit's life," Jake Morrison observed, appearing at Ezra's elbow with 2 glasses of the miller's best whiskey. "Quite a change indeed." Ezra accepted the drink gratefully. "You know, Jake, there was a time when I thought happiness was the absence of pain. Now I understand it's the presence of love, even when love makes you vulnerable to pain." Wise words from a wise man. Jake raised his glass. "To love that's worth waiting for. To love that's worth the wait." As they drank, Clara approached with something cupped in her palms. "Look what I found," she said, opening her hands to reveal the promise stone she'd dropped 6 months ago during their dramatic reunion. Someone had picked it up and kept it safe, and now it had found its way back to them. "What should we do with it?" Ezra asked, taking the smooth stone and feeling its familiar weight. "I have an idea." Clara's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Come with me." She led him to a spot at the edge of the meadow where someone had already planted a small garden. Wedding gifts from the community in the form of vegetable starts and flower seeds. "We'll bury it here," Clara said, taking a small spade from among the gardening tools. "Let it be the foundation of something new." Together, they dug a small hole and placed the stone carefully in the earth. 10 years, Clara said softly. "That stone waited 10 years to bring us together. And now it starts a new kind of waiting," Ezra replied, covering it with soil. "Waiting for seeds to grow, for seasons to turn, for the life we're going to build together." As they worked side by side, their hands dirty with good earth, and their hearts full of possibility, Ezra marveled at the change in his circumstances. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely hermit, convinced that his best years were behind him. Now he was a husband with a wife who chose to love him not despite his age, but because of the wisdom it had brought him. The garden they were planting would grow and change with the seasons, requiring patience and care and the kind of daily attention that builds something lasting. Much like a marriage, Ezra reflected. Much like love itself. "Ezra," Clara said, straightening up and brushing dirt from her hands, "do you know what I realized during our years apart?" "What's that?" "I realized that I never wanted you to be younger. I wanted you to be braver." She smiled, reaching up to touch his graying beard. "Age isn't something to overcome. It's something to offer. You're giving me the gift of a man who's been tested by life and chosen to remain gentle. That's worth more than all the youth in the world." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Clara and Ezra remained in their small garden, planning where to plant tomatoes and beans, debating the merits of different flowers, talking about the future with the quiet contentment of people who'd learned not to waste the present. The promised stone lay buried beneath their feet. Its long vigil ended, but its purpose fulfilled. Love, like gardens, required patience. It required the faith to plant seeds without guarantee of harvest, the wisdom to tend what grew, and the courage to begin again when seasons changed. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and from the celebration behind them came the sound of laughter and music and community, all the things that made life rich and worth living. Ezra McKinnon had spent 30 years believing he was too old for love. He'd spent 9 more learning to live without it. But now, at 57, with his young wife's hand in his and good earth beneath their feet, he understood that some stories were worth the wait. Love, he discovered, wasn't about the arithmetic of age or the calculation of years remaining. It was about the grace to accept a gift freely given and the wisdom to tend it with grateful hands. In the garden, they would build together, surrounded by the community that had watched them find their way to each other. Ezra and Clara McKinnon began the work of growing old together, day by day, season by season. With the patient faith of gardeners who plant for harvests they may never see but trust others to enjoy. The mountain man who'd once believed himself too old for love had learned, at last, that the heart knows no such boundaries. And in learning that lesson, he'd found not just love, but the courage to believe in all the tomorrows yet to come.